his role at Columbia, Marcos is director of the Intelligent Tech and Trade Initiative, a project examining the impact of augmented intelligence and blockchain on global trade. He is also managing partner of the Center for Business Diplomacy, a global advisory firm, and very importantly, I think also foreign affairs commentator now for Rádio Jovem Pan. A former diplomat, Marcos is well known to many of us here for his very thoughtful observations on global trade, economic trends, trends in technology, innovation, and how these forces are all sort of shaping the trajectory for growth in Latin America and around the world. He has a PhD in sociology from the University of São Paulo and has pursued postdoctoral studies at Columbia, and is an alumni of the Instituto Rio Branco and has lectured at many universities around the world, and we are delighted that he is here today to share some thoughts with us on Brazil and where this is all headed.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Gabriele, for the generous introduction. Thank you, Tad, for the opportunity. I also want to say hi to everyone, particularly to Sérgio Miller, my lifelong friend. It's wonderful to be here and be given this chance to share with you some of my views of where Brazil is coming from, where we are, where we're going to. Tad has asked me to sort of take a broader picture as reference for what I'm going to say. So the formal title of my speech is Globalization is Evolving. How will Brazil respond, right? But before anything, I'd like to ask you whether, my friends, you have come across this book that appeared some 5-6 years ago by Darren Acemoglu, a professor of economics at MIT, and James Robinson. The book is called Why Nations Fail. Do you know this book? Well, it's a fascinating book, and it's a publication that tries to answer this very old question: what is it that countries have to have in order to rise? And what are the characteristics that countries should avoid in order to fail, right? So, in thinking about this question, especially when it comes to common sense, I'm pretty sure many of you have already heard that countries succeed, countries prosper, they become more powerful when countries have in the past experienced the sharpening school of war, especially those of an older generation. They say, oh, look at Brazil. Brazilians take things for granted because they have never really experienced the horrors of a war. Look at Japan or Germany or these other nations that have endured war conditions. That's what it takes to put together the discipline and the strategic planning so as to face reality in its own terms. But if this were true, then Egypt would be the most successful country in the world, right? Or Russia would have a GDP per capita north of $80,000 a year, because these countries have, for generations, for millennia really, experienced the horrors of war, and as a consequence, they have not necessarily become prosperous. Then others would say, well, it's not really wars that makes for a country's greatness. It's institutions, right? It's a free press. It's the division of powers in at least 3 hubs: the executive, the judiciary, the legislative. You have to have independent control agencies. You have to have a strong civil society. You have to have a very clear fault line between what government is and what civil society is. If this was true, and this is, of course, the most important argument of the book that I had just mentioned to you, Why Nations Fail, it's all about institutions. And don't get me wrong, if you look into my heart, it's written institutions. But institutions alone do not serve to explain why, for example, the most important economic miracle of mankind, which is what we've been witnessing since 1978 in China, was mostly undertaken without any of these preconditions that one generally looks into when it comes to institutions. China moved up from being in 1978 a $200 billion economy to a $12 trillion economy, treading fast towards overtaking the U.S. as the world's largest GDP without necessarily putting together the institutions that are so commonly referred to as preconditions to economic prosperity. Well, others are going to say, well, it's not really institutions. What does make the difference in the world when it comes to the success of a society is science and technology, right? If you have the necessary allocation of resources and people to science and technology, then you're going to have a better chance to fare well in the contemporary world. Well, if this was true, then look at what happened to the Soviet Union, right? Because, say, in the early 1970s, 25% of the world's scientists and technology experts either lived or operated under the umbrella of the Soviet Union. And they were spending like 5% of its gross domestic product in science and technology-related objectives. And, of course, they accomplished very important things, like sending a man out to the moon, to outer space, Yuri Gagarin, even a little dog, right? Laika, right? But they would not have an alarm clock that would ring on time or a bicycle that would rotate well. Others are going to say, well, it's not really science and technology. What does make the difference is the investment in education. In the last edition of the Davos Forum, Gillian Tett, John Moncur's colleague at the Financial Times, asked three very important global CEOs what were the three most important aspects one should bring up in order to face Industry 4.0, and they all answered education, education, education. But is education really at the heart of China's economic miracle of the past 40 years? Or even, to use another example that I think is generally interpreted in mistaken ways, is education really responsible for the South Korean miracle? Or was it a combination of trade policy and industrial policy that allowed for these societies to put together the necessary resources to then, of course, direct a significant share of their wealth towards education? And then something else that it's been ringing quite a lot this past few days, I'm sure you've heard that already. People say that in order for countries to take the shortcut of history towards prosperity, it's very difficult to do so in a democratic environment. Democracy creates more problems. It brings up more obstacles than solutions when it comes to promoting economic growth at a higher speed, a short period of time, right? And they say, well, look what's happening in China. Because China is an autocratic system, this is the way to go. But if this is true, and only resorting to China's example itself, from 1949, the year of the Maoist revolution, to 1978, when Deng Xiaoping consolidates power in China, China wasn't going anywhere. And it was a dictatorship. Look at Russia. Look at countries of Latin America where we've had less democratic oxygen in the past, and not necessarily the preconditions for economic prosperity were created. So I do away with all of this simple, superficial, common sense-like notions of economic prosperity. And if you remember nothing of what I'm going to tell you this afternoon, make sure that you remember what I'm going to tell you now, right? Countries rise, economies prosper when countries devise and implement a successful strategy to adapt to the contours of globalization. Countries rise, economies prosper when they're able to devise, they read the economic scenario, and they put together a strategy to adapt successfully. Adapting successfully means avoiding the risks, enhancing the chance of success of that particular opportunity that's given by a set of characteristics that shape a certain time in the evolution of globalization. So let me give you a few examples in this particular regard, because the problem with this approach and the problem of trying to insert Brazil in this bigger framework is that globalization changes over time. Certain characteristics are retained as valid for a while, but then they change, right? I like very much the word época, as we say it in Portuguese, because it means parenthesis. So within two parentheses, some characteristics remain the same, but then they change. So when Brazil, for example, was trying to stabilize its economy in the second half of the 1990s, and when the Real Plan was so successfully adopted, what was the world like? That was a world of deep globalization. The notion of free markets is the most important lever to the production of economic prosperity. The idea is that representative democracies were the way to organize your relationship between civil society and government. And also the idea that nations, in terms of economics of scale, and in order to better improve their border conditions, were uniting with their neighbors. It's the case of the European Union. Think of the Maastricht Treaty of the early 1990s. It was the case of NAFTA, the free trade agreement of the United States integrating with Canada and Mexico. It was the case of Mercosur. It is as if in the future a German would be less German and more European. This was the way to go. So if you wanted to be successful in the 90s, if you wanted to be successful in the aftermath of the Cold War, Brazil had to adapt to this scenario. And Brazil was somewhat successful because it took advantage of the abundant flows of capital to help stabilize its economy. It did very little in terms of trade integration. It did very little in terms of structural reforms, but it did a lot in terms of macroeconomic adjustment. And that is one of the reasons why one of Brazil's twin sisters of World War II economics was done away with. Of course, here I'm talking about chronic inflation. Come the Lula and Dilma government, the situation changed completely. We no longer lived in the world of deep globalization, but it's a different global framework. It is, especially from 2008 onwards, what I like to call a world of deglobalization, where the risk of deglobalization is very strong. So this is a trend that's not beginning with Trump, and it's not even beginning with Brexit. It's something that dates back to the Great Recession. It dates back to the backlash against free markets and free economies as a collateral effect of the Great Recession of the of the first decade of the 2000s, right? And then you have a metamorphosis of globalization. So where you had free markets previously in deep globalization as your reference, this is progressively being substituted by the notion that the generation of local jobs and local taxes is more important than economic performance. That is why one of the rules of the contemporary world since 2008 is what I like to name local contentism. It's the idea that you should produce yourself within your own borders some of the goods that in other scenarios were delegated to global production chains. So it's about producing locally. No, but the cost is high. It doesn't matter. Jobs will be generated locally. Taxes will be generated locally. So if this is true, then free markets and free trade walk away from the center of the stage, and progressively you have notions like economic protectionism, economic nationalism, in one word, local contentism. Second characteristic, which also is something that we were seeing since 2008. Who told you that Western democracy is the best way to organize yourself politically, right? If you look at Europe, or if you look at the United States, the tug of war between legislators and the executive branch, and the kind of money you need to fuel electoral cycles that takes place every 4 years, that's too dysfunctional. Look at what's happening to China. So even the centrality of Western democracies is no longer there. It's not that it's been replaced or substituted by something that is superior or that is now the new compass, but once again, Western democracies have lost their centrality. And thirdly, where you had a number of years ago the certainty that we would more and more integrate with our neighbors. Look at the Brazilian passport, for example. It has the crest of the republic, the name, Federative Republic of Brazil. And underneath, what is it that you read? Mercosur. Because you were guaranteed to know that the future belongs to economic, political, and regional integration. You see that even in deeper terms in other parts of the world, like Europe. They've put together a common court in Strasbourg and a common Congress, common parliament in Brussels. So this is where we are today. So adapting successfully to globalization today means adapting to protectionism, adapting to local contentism, adapting to a political scenario where Western democracies no longer have the center space, and where regional economic integration is an uncertainty. We're not sure whether this is going to continue to happen. But we are looking towards the future. This is a very important year for Brazil to rethink itself. So on the one hand, you have what you've heard this morning. You have the fiscal adjustment. You have the importance of fiscal responsibility. You want the country to be well managed in macroeconomic terms. Apart from that, you want to carry on with the fight against corruption, and we should in no way downplay the role that Lava Jato, car wash, does have in the way the future of Brazil will be shaped. But either bringing Brazil to a better situation in macroeconomic terms, or even if by drinking this water of the Harvard Club, all Brazilians, not only in this room but the other 280 million, wake up angels the next day, this is not going to suffice. It is not going to suffice to face the challenges of the 21st century. There has to be a strategy. Brazil, within this next cycle of years, from 2019 to 2022, will have to devise and implement a strategy to successfully adapt to the changing contours of globalization. And what will these contours be? Right? So this is the second thing that I wanted you to remember, right? Well, one of the chief characteristics of the world that is emerging is what I like to call the emergence of Chindia. Not China, Sergio, Chindia, right? Why, right? Because you have this rise of China. We're talking about, once again, a $13 trillion GDP economy, right? But China is changing the nature of its economic expansion. China will more and more do to others what others did to China. Because costs of production in China are going up so much, China is pushing to the countries of its geoeconomic vicinity some of the more low added value economic activities to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and particularly India. Because India has the territorial scale, the population scale, the managerial capacity to absorb an important part of the economic activities that were being carried out in China. This is why India today has one of the most one of the smartest industrial policy programs in the world. It's called Make in India. Not made in India. Make in India. Come make in India. They have their radars on. They know that this is happening. They are attracting Chinese investment. And the scale of it all is so impressive that this is going to bring about two characteristics that will influence Brazil in a major way for the next couple of decades. The first is Brazil will never go back to being a low-cost country, even if it enacts all of the social security, tax, and modernizing reforms it must. It will never go back because it will never be able to compete in terms of low-cost structures with the low wages of Southeast Asia. Right? So if you're like saying, oh, of course, wages in China are going up so much, so now there's going to be a diversion of the international flows of manufacturing to higher low labor costs in Brazil. Brazil's become cheap again. It's not going to happen. Because in comparative terms, Southeast Asia will offer cheaper opportunities, once again, in countries like Vietnam and Myanmar and so forth. Is this bad for Brazil? Yes, because it means that you're not going to be able to compete in low value-added goods. But can this also be good for Brazil? Absolutely, especially in agricultural terms. And this is one of the reasons why I commend Ted for putting together for the first time a panel on agriculture at this summit. Because if you take into consideration the GDP per capita of all of these countries, China, India, Vietnam, all of them, Southeast Asia, excluding Japan, and of course, pay attention, when China's in the picture, the average income per capita goes up because it's already 12,000 GDP per capita economy. The average GDP per capita there is about $3,000 a year. $3,000. And in terms of global scale, you're talking about 45 to 50% of the world population. And you talk about when you examine economic projection, you're talking about a region of the world that's going to grow more than 5% a year every year for the next 15 years. Well, if you're growing 5% a year every year for the next decade and a half, out of a basis of $3,000, what is it that you do with the incremental income? You eat more. You consume more calories, and you build more. You spend more money on infrastructure. That means there is, what we're seeing today is a structural change in the global demand for agricultural and mineral commodities. It is going to be there for a long time. So if you are used to the narrative that countries like Brazil and Chile and Peru were, they had the tailwind of commodities as a result of China's increased demand, and this was the characteristic of the past decade, but this is gone, forget it. It is going to be there again. So India, especially, once again, and for markets of consumption of agriculture and mineral commodities, a very important destination. It will offer Brazil the possibility of a choice, whether to use these incremental resources to promote the necessary changes to increase its competitiveness, or else to play the populist policies of the past, as we've seen in the past decades and a half. So this is very important. When it comes to industrialization and manufacturing, of course, the big question here is, well, if you cannot compete in terms of the cost of labor, what is the niche of competition you're going to devote yourself to? I don't know. It's a big question mark. We have to strategize, but it's a question that we should have before ourselves. Second characteristic of this world that is coming up, I think, for the next couple of years. This is not going to be a world in which the U.S. is walking away from the global stage. Trumpism will be, as I see it, a short-lived phenomenon, for the very fact that it hurts American global corporate interests. There's no country in the world with so many multinational corporations as the United States. If all of a sudden, on behalf of local contism, you have a policy that reverts global change, there's no one to lose the most than the American economy itself. It's against its interests. It may create punctual benefits when it comes to local jobs here and there, generation of local taxes here and there, but at the end of the day, it's going to hurt American balance sheets, it's going to hurt their performance in the stock markets, it's going to hurt the American economy. As a result, in terms of the way the trade architectures of the future, of the present and the future, will be organized, I see more and more a situation that can be seen in what is now being called the TPP light. It's achieved by Japan, Australia, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Chile, countries of New Zealand as well, where the most important provision does not relate to lowering tariffs or to doing away with trade quotas, but it has to do with establishment of common standards. A common standard for the way you organize your labor legislation, a common standard for the way you organize your environmental legislation, a common standard for how you respect intellectual property rights, the common standards according to which government will be able to participate as a buyer in the economy. So we're talking here about government acquisitions. So it will be about standards. So if the trade architectures of the future are about standards, then regional considerations are no longer important. Peru is much closer to Brazil than it is to New Zealand. But if Peru and New Zealand adopt the same standards, they're going to be more integrated economically. And it's very interesting to see how in the aftermath of the announcement of the TPP Light, the Ministry of Industry and Trade of Japan went out and said it will be wonderful if the United Kingdom wishes to join us as a member of the Trade Pact in the future. So the trade pacts of the future will be less about trade. They'll be less about investment. They'll be more about this common standards. So this is very important for Brazil to realize. And thirdly, of course, I don't have to spend much time about this, but there's something that is emerging before our eyes, which is, some people call it the fourth industrial revolution, others call it Industry 4.0. But this is going to change everything. It's changing everything. It's changing everything. And whether you are a barber shop or a law firm or you know, a tech-intensive startup, in reality, what you are is you're a technology firm. If you're a newspaper, you're a technology firm. It's technology across the board. The funny thing about it is that it's not technology that's going to necessarily make the difference. It's the way you build your creativity around that technology that will, at the end, count. Technology will be commoditized. Is the way you become flexible, adaptable, especially when you're organizing, for example, the training of your workforce, that is really going to make a difference. And why is this such a big challenge for a country like Brazil? Because like it or not, and it is true that we have wasted a significant portion of our demographic bonus, Brazil is still a very young country, very young. When Marx wrote Das Kapital, the capital, in the second half of the 19th century, life expectancy at birth at the world's most advanced economy, which was the UK, was 38 years of age. Today, in a country like Brazil, life expectancy at birth is edging close to 80 years old. So that means that in order to play a constructive, a functional role in Industry 4.0, when you reach the age of 25, 30, you have to have embedded in yourself about 10,000 hours of practice and training. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to adapt to this new situation. If you reach that age without the 10,000, or at least without 1,000, it's not like it's not like Marx's England that you're going to die at 38. Your life expectancy at birth is at 80. So what is it that you're going to do with your life from the age of 25 to the age of 80? My impression is that you're going to be not very useful for cloud computing or robotics or automation or 3D printing or intelligent marketing, but you are going to be extraordinarily useful to things like piracy, drug trafficking, the illegal commerce of arms, areas where we certainly do not want to see Brazil thrive. But this is the reality on the ground. Why am I making these considerations, my friends? Because at a particular juncture, And hopefully, some of our macroeconomic adjustments will have to be, we'll see behind them. And even the political uncertainty that's surrounding the elections of October, there will come a time where we are going to have to face these questions head on, right? And if we heed the lessons of history, we know that it's by adapting successfully to these new drivers that's where the chance for Brazil's future resides. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you for that very enlightening talk and provocative talk. Mm-hmm. So when you talked about the increase in the demand for agriculture and minerals because of the higher consumption of food and infrastructure, it augurs well for Brazil as a primary exporting good country. Well, what do you do then? Do you stay as a primary good exporting country, or how do you take that value-added gain in quantity and price of commodities? What do you do with it?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the question. In the experiences we have studied, the US, China, South Korea, countries that moved from being simple agricultural or mineral exporters to becoming tech-intensive economies, there is always one precondition for that leap forward to take place, which is a huge accumulation of resources in a particular area. In the case of the US, it was agriculture also that allowed for the industrial leap. In China, it was the low cost of labor for a while. It's no longer the case. Today, the cost of manufacturing between the United States and China is only about 5%. South Korea, the same. So there has to be, as a precondition, a period in time in which you accumulate in order to invest in things like research, development, ease to do business environment, and so forth. I hope, right, fingers crossed, that Brazil is given that chance again, because it's been given that chance in the past, right, and it decided to do other things rather than to direct its resources to actually producing the real drivers of prosperity over time. The good news is that the environment that allows for these preconditions to emerge is here with us again, and as I see it, will be here with us for a long time.
See, yes, there's some question back there.
Hi, really good insights on Chindia, if you will. I like that. In fact, I'm leaving for India tonight. Following up on his question with what you do with the resources, and that's a constant issue for Brazil, is how do you make the country better with all this incremental wealth, incremental resources? I mean, China, in a sense, got most of that incremental wealth from the United States' incestuous demand for low-cost goods, and then they kind of took a socialistic approach to bringing people out of poverty, taking them off the farms and putting them in high rises. What do you see for Brazil? I mean, you've got the communities which are challenged. What would your vision be of the right way to solve that problem?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Just as a forward, there is no incompatibility between being a major producer and exporter of commodities and being a tech-intensive economy. By the way, do you know what's the world's #1 country in terms of production of commodities? Sorry? It's the United States. The United States is the #1 producer and exporter of commodities, right? Still one of the most tech-intensive countries in the world. No country in the world deposits more patents in the intellectual property organization than the United States. You want another example? Look at Australia. Okay? Very strong in producing and exporting commodities, very strong in tech and tech. So it's not only the kind of things that you either produce or export, it's the amount of value addition that you see in the production itself. Can a 210 million people country like Brazil resort solely on its agriculture and its mineral productions as the leverage to economic development? I don't think it can. I don't think it can. Are there examples in Brazil's economic trajectory of putting together the right tools to allow for tech intensiveness? Yes, there are. Look at Embraer, for example. My God, Embraer has become the world's third largest producer of aircraft. Embraer today is the third largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. It's an area that's as tech intensive you can get. But then you see in that specific example, all of the preconditions coming together. Privileged access to capital, privileged access to knowledge, an environment that allows for innovation to take place, the hub of São José dos Campos, a knowledge institution being mirrored at the MIT, which is the Technological Institute of the Air Force there. So there are very good examples in Brazil as well. But once again, does Brazil have the strategy to adapt successfully to the changing contours of globalization? Macroeconomic adjustment, we have to do it, okay? Good governance politics, absolutely. But where is the strategy? This third element of success is compulsory in promoting a brighter day for Brazil.
Seems to me that to put a strategy together, you have to be smart, but before that, you have to have the guts, the courage, whatever the more.
If you have the guts, you're not smart. Just kidding.
Right. But what I'm saying is, where we get that? Is it a leader going to have to rise? Is the top minds in Brazil going to have to come together with people such as yourself and the others that are here and make that decision? Because if you don't have that strength of character, you can't do it.
Sure.
Facing the difficult questions, you said. We're going to have to face the difficult questions.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny. I mean, I've studied this. It's a wonderful question. I've studied this issue a lot, and I'm really fascinated by what you can call paradigm shift, because what you're describing is a paradigm shift. You're moving from one model of doing things to the next, which is superior in sophistication and effectiveness and everything else. And generally, in the examples I have studied, there's only a paradigm shift where you see a pact involving the elite. Right? Look at what's happened in Spain with the so-called Moncloa Pact in 1982. Look at what's emerged in China in 1978 with power being granted to those who were representing the ideas of Deng Xiaoping. Look at what happened in South Korea during the Park government. So there's always it's funny, there is a pact that sort of freezes some attrition, some social demands for a while, for the sake of something that is greater, right? So people stop suffering and they start sacrificing. It's a precondition, right? The thing is, the beauty about the relationship between globalization and a particular country's situation is that when the situation globally is very favorable, as it is now for Brazil, the world is smiling at Brazil. It's offering Brazil a Black Friday opportunity, right? Commodity prices are high, liquidity is available, lots of capital are willing to go over because of infrastructure or M&A activity. The world is beautiful for Brazil, but you have to adapt in order to bridge those resources in. It will include a pact. Sometimes the pact is an electoral cycle. It's the mandate the population is giving the new president. Sometimes is what happened after that president has taken office. He's going to gather the political forces and say, this is what we're going to have to do. But as you said, it's going to take guts, it's going to take perseverance, it's going to take vision. You know what's a good example for Brazil? And let me knock on wood, because there are so many things that are not to be copied. But what Macron is doing with France facing some of the challenges or some of the toughest tasks head on at the beginning of his mandate is a pretty good example for Brazil. You have to do the hard part first. So the first 6 months of 2019 will be very much important in terms of how the pact that I mentioned to you is going to unfold. And of course, once again, you have to have the people, right? I mean, you have to have the team to implement the pact. So no savior of the world here. It's going to take a team. Hopefully, it will be assembled. The Brazilian lead, yeah.
Any more questions?
Hi. May I ask another question? Thank you very much for I second the gentleman, their very proactive presentation, but also I will add it's very informative one. My question goes back to your take about Brazil and China. In 1978, China opened up, and then the GDP of China then was a similar level of GDP of Brazil. So what happened? Today we see China, up there, and we see Brazil still at the same level. Can you just shine some light from your understanding as to what happened? Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you. It is not 100% precise to say that from 1978 onwards, China opened up. The phenomenon is better described as from 1978 onwards, China devised and adapted a strategy to successfully face the changing contours of globalization. And that strategy was made up of 4 elements, okay? 1, China was given most favored nation status in its trade with the United States, and then later with its trade in its trade with Europe. So that gave China a sort of privileged access. It was like a unilateral free trade agreement with the most important buying markets of the world, right? So you have no obstacles for trade. Then people look at the situation of China domestically, they say, well, costs of labor are very low, but there's no infrastructure, right? And you need infrastructure. The Chinese government has no indigenous capital whatsoever to invest in its own infrastructure. How are we going to solve that problem? So if you're Philips and you want to manufacture TV sets in China, what is it that you do? You reach an agreement with the Chinese local authority. So besides the manufacturing hub itself, you invest in a local power plant or in a local railway or an airport. So it's funny, but a very significant ingredient of China's foreign trade success is that China implemented before many other countries in the world what today we call a public-private partnership that allowed for the expansion of infrastructure. 3, China, unlike Brazil, managed artificially some of the remuneration of the factors of the economy. If you look, we were talking about, telling Ted this earlier on, the expansion of China's GDP from 1978 to today, and the expansion of China's wage as a percentage of the economy. The first curve is like this. The second is not as aggressive. This is one of the reasons why when the governor of China's central bank goes to sleep every night, he looks at the safe and he sees $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. They saved on things like labor and on things like the exchange rate. They artificially managed the exchange rate in order to promote for the competitiveness of exports. And fourth, of course, China became a very aggressive, very vibrant, very active promoter of its own trade abroad. Right? So these are the 4 elements that explain China's success. We have seen nothing of that in Brazil. Nothing of that in Brazil. By now, when you talked about 1978, China's population was 1 billion. Brazil's population was 100 million. China's GDP was 200 billion. Brazil was 200 billion. Exactly the same. So 40 years ago, a Brazilian was 10 times richer than one Chinese. Today, it's about the same. Actually, China GDP per capita is a little higher. But that's going to change. Thank you, Imagina. Valeu. Obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcos, for those remarks. A big thank you to Marcos, to all of our speakers, to our special guests, and our participants. This concludes our 2018 Brazil Summit. And before we all leave the room, I just want to acknowledge and congratulate Ted Helms, Ruchi Phillips, Ivalice Soto, and the whole staff of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce for their dedication, not just to the organization and the mission, but all their behind-the-scenes efforts to make this event happen. So thank you very much. We hope to see, I think, all of you on May 15th at the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce Person of the Year Awards, honoring Michael Bloomberg and Sergio Moro. And with that, hope to also see you next year. Thank you.